Today, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are blackmailing the dying king over access to his two grandchildren, and they're not even trying to hide it anymore.
April 1, 2000.
They said it was supposed to be a quiet family reunion, but behind palace walls, it exploded into something far darker, far colder, and far more calculated than anyone is willing to admit publicly. Because what if this wasn't about love at all? What if this was a negotiation, a deal, a pressure game where grandchildren became leverage and a king was pushed into a corner he never expected to face? April 1st to now 2026. A date that sounds like a joke, but inside Buckingham Palace, nothing feels funny. Not when whispers of a private summit at Balmoral have turned into something insiders are now calling a psychological standoff. A grandfather reaching out and a response coming back not with warmth but with conditions, demands, clauses, and something chilling hiding between every line. The invitation was simple on the surface. A quiet meeting, a chance for King Charles to finally see Archie and Lilibet, but sources claim that what came back from California wasn't acceptance, it was a 15-page document. Not a letter, not a family message. A document, structured, legal, strategic, and according to insiders, explosive. Because suddenly, this wasn't about a visit anymore. It became a negotiation wrapped in emotional language but driven by something far sharper. No security, no grandchildren. That's the phrase that began circulating behind closed doors. And just like that, the tone changed. Completely. Think about it. A father asking to see his grandchildren and being told there are conditions attached. Not emotional ones, legal ones, financial ones, strategic ones. And the palace? They didn't see concern. They saw pressure. Calculated pressure. Behind the scenes, March 2026 became a battlefield of quiet exchanges. Letters passed through legal teams, messages filtered through media leaks. Every word carefully crafted. Every silence intentional. And while the public focused on headlines about security, insiders say something much bigger was unfolding. Because this document, this now infamous 15-page list, didn't just talk about safety. It outlined demands that reached deep into the structure of the monarchy itself. Travel conditions, financial arrangements, even how the children would be officially recognized. And not in a sentimental way, but in a way critics say felt disturbingly commercial. One demand in particular has shaken royal insiders to the core. The issue of passports. Not just passports, but how the titles prince and princess would appear on them. Not as minor notes, not as secondary identifiers, but as primary, visible, diplomatically significant designations. Why does that matter? Because insiders believe this wasn't about identity. It was about positioning, about branding, about securing something permanent, something official that could extend far beyond a single visit. A stamp, a label, a status that carries weight globally. And suddenly, the conversation shifted. This wasn't just family. This was power, influence, control. While the palace tried to keep things quiet, frustration began leaking through trusted sources. Because inside those walls, the reaction wasn't calm. It wasn't understanding. It was shock. Deep, uncomfortable shock. King Charles, already navigating personal health battles, was reportedly blindsided. Not by the distance, not by the strained relationship, but by the tone, the structure, the implication that seeing his grandchildren now required negotiation. And then came the number that made everything even heavier. 20 million, not whispered, not rumored, written, requested. A trust fund framed as compensation. Compensation for what exactly? That's where things get even more intense. The reasoning, according to insiders, was that Archie and Lilibet had been deprived of their royal environment, their heritage, their birthright, and therefore they were owed something. Not emotionally, financially. Pause for a second. Let that sink in. A family reunion tied to a financial framework. And inside the palace that didn't just raise eyebrows. It triggered something deeper, something defensive. Because to them, this crossed a line. A line between personal and institutional. Between family and monarchy. While Charles reportedly wrestled with emotion, one figure didn't hesitate. Princess Anne. Calm. Direct. Unmoved. Insiders say she became the voice of resistance almost instantly. No compromise. No negotiation. No bending. Because to her, this wasn't just about one meeting. It was about precedent. About what happens if the monarchy starts responding to pressure like this. What it signals. What it invites next. And then there's Prince William. Quiet publicly, but behind closed doors. Sources describe his reaction as explosive. Not loud. Not dramatic. But cold. Final. A line drawn clearly in the sand. Because from his perspective, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. A structured attempt to reshape how the monarchy interacts with those outside its working core. And he wasn't having it. As days passed, tension only grew thicker. Meetings delayed. Decisions paused. No confirmations for April 20th. Nothing locked in. Everything hanging in this strange, uncomfortable limbo. And then came another layer. The demand for private American medical teams, psychologists, consultants, not suggestions, requirements, for a short visit, for a family meeting, inside the palace that didn't read as care. It read as something else entirely. A message, a signal that British systems weren't trusted, that the environment itself was questionable. And that's when whispers started turning into something darker. A word began floating through private conversations. Control. Because when you step back and look at it, the conditions, the documents, the financial requests, the branding implications, it starts to feel less like a visit and more like a framework, a controlled environment, a curated situation. Even the idea of narrative control reportedly surfaced. Concerns that the reunion itself could become content. That moments meant to be private could be shaped, framed, and eventually shared. And suddenly, the stakes changed completely. This wasn't just about whether the visit would happen. It became about what it meant if it did. Because if one side was bringing conditions and the other was holding the line, then something had to break. And as March came to a close, that breaking point was getting dangerously close. The palace wasn't just hesitating anymore. It was preparing to respond, preparing to decide, preparing to either accept or completely shut the door on what was once called a simple family reunion. But here's the real question that no one is answering publicly. Was this ever meant to happen? Or was this entire situation designed to collapse so that when it did, one side could walk away not as the one who refused, but as the one who was denied? Because if that's true, then everything we're seeing isn't just conflict, it's strategy. And the next move could change everything. Because what happened next is where everything stops looking like a misunderstanding and starts looking like a full-scale psychological chess game with no intention of peace. As March 31st arrived, something shifted inside the palace. The waiting ended, the hesitation disappeared, and behind closed doors, a response was finalized, not as a negotiation, but as a decision, a final one. Sources close to the inner circle reveal that this wasn't drafted lightly, this wasn't emotional, it wasn't reactive, it was calculated, structured, firm, and it carried a message that would ripple far beyond this single conflict. Every demand in that 15-page manifesto rejected, not adjusted, not negotiated, not softened, rejected. And that moment, that exact moment, is where the illusion of a possible reconciliation shattered completely. Because for weeks there had been this fragile idea floating around, a hope that somehow, despite everything, this meeting could still happen. That family would override strategy, that emotion would win. But what insiders now confirm is chilling. The palace didn't see a family situation anymore. They saw a framework of pressure, and they refused to engage with it. The demand for the $20 million trust fund dismissed outright, not debated, not reconsidered. Because within the palace, it wasn't seen as support. It was seen as something far more dangerous, a precedent. One that, if accepted, could open the floodgates to future demands wrapped in emotional narratives. And the passport issue? That was a breaking point. Because behind the scenes, government-level conversations had already begun, quietly, urgently. The idea of altering official documentation to elevate titles into primary identifiers wasn't just controversial, it was explosive. It raised questions no one wanted to answer publicly. Could royal titles become tools? Could they be structured in a way that extended beyond tradition into something transactional? And when those questions surfaced, the answer from the palace was immediate. No. But it didn't stop there. Because what truly shook the system was the implication behind those demands. Insiders began connecting dots that, at first, seemed unrelated, but suddenly formed a pattern. A diplomatic-style status on passports combined with security demands, combined with international presence. It started to look like a workaround, a backdoor strategy. Because if those titles were elevated in official documentation, it could potentially shift how protection and privilege are applied internationally. It could bypass decisions already made. It could rewrite the outcome of legal battles that had already been lost. And that's when the tone inside the palace hardened. This wasn't about children anymore. This was about structure, control, authority. And the monarchy wasn't about to bend. Prince William's position reportedly became crystal clear during this phase. No more middle ground, no more emotional negotiation, no more attempts to understand the situation. Sources say he viewed the entire situation as a calculated escalation, not a misunderstanding, not a plea, a move. And once you see it as a move, you respond accordingly. Cold, direct, final. Princess Anne, meanwhile, remained exactly what insiders describe as the immovable force. While others processed emotions, she focused on consequences, on long-term impact, on what happens if even one demand is accepted. Because in her view, this wasn't just about today, it was about what happens next year, and the year after that. And the monarchy doesn't operate on short-term emotion, it operates on survival. Then came the most controversial demand of all, the one that insiders say triggered absolute disbelief within the palace walls. The NDA requirement, not a standard agreement, not a routine confidentiality clause, a California-style, highly restrictive restrictive legal document that would require every single staff member at Balmoral to sign. Chefs, assistants, medical personnel, even long-serving royal aides. Think about that for a second. A king's own staff being asked to sign private legal contracts tied to a family visit. And not just any contracts, contracts that would control what they could say, what they could observe, even how they could interpret emotional reactions. That's not privacy. That's control. Absolute control. And inside the palace, that crossed a line no one was willing to even approach. Because what it suggested was something deeply uncomfortable. That the visit itself might not remain private. That it could be documented, managed, curated, and eventually used. The idea that Balmoral, one of the most personal and private royal residences, could become a controlled environment under external legal authority? Unacceptable. Completely. And that's when the final stance was locked in. No NDAs, no financial arrangements, no passport alterations, no external control over internal operations, nothing. The message was simple, but devastating in its clarity. You are welcome as family, but not under conditions. And that's where everything collapsed, because from the other side, that response wasn't seen as protection. It was seen as refusal. A refusal to provide security. A refusal to acknowledge identity. A refusal to meet what had been framed as basic requirements. And just like that, the narrative split into two completely different realities. Inside the palace, boundaries. Outside, rejection. And in that gap, something powerful happened. A narrative began forming, quietly, strategically, through selective leaks and carefully worded statements. The image of a stingy king started circulating. A grandfather who, despite immense wealth, refused to ensure the safety of his own grandchildren. A monarch who could fund ceremonies, renovations, public appearances, but drew the line at private protection. It was subtle, but effective. Because public perception doesn't need full information. It just needs a compelling angle. And that angle was taking shape. At the same time, another layer of pressure emerged. The idea that without these conditions being met, bringing the children to the UK would be unsafe. That the environment itself remained hostile, unresolved, risky. And suddenly, the situation flipped. The visit wasn't cancelled because of demands. It was impossible because of safety. What if every demand, every document, every condition was part of a much larger strategy? A strategy where the goal wasn't agreement. It was exposure. Because now, the world isn't just watching a family conflict. It's watching two completely different systems collide. One built on tradition, structure, and control. The other built on narrative, positioning, and global influence. And neither side is backing down. So the question isn't who won this round. The real question is, what happens when the next move isn't private anymore? Because if this was the quiet version of the conflict, then what comes next might not be quiet at all.